this was about as bizarre and as easy as it gets.
So the number for me was a number that would allow me to never have to work again.
I feel like we got top.
I went from a sale of $500,000 to in debt.
$192 million.
This is Built to Sell Radio with your host, John Warlow.
So do you remember Sully, the guy who landed the plane on the Hudson River? He had done everything there is to do in an airplane. He was even a trainer of other pilots, yet he had never had the opportunity to land an airplane on the Hudson River. He had one shot at greasing that landing, and he nailed it. And when it comes to selling your business, you've got one shot to make sure you punch above your weight when you go to sell your company. One shot to make sure you don't make some of the most common mistakes that entrepreneurs make when they sell their business. That's why I wrote the book, The Art of Selling Your Business. It's a field guide for anyone looking to sell their company. You can get it along with some gifts for my listeners at builttosell.com/selling. Hey, thanks for joining. It's about a minute to the top of the hour. I'm John Warlow. I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Dr. Jeremy Weisz, who is the co-founder of Rise25, and I'll introduce him in a second, but I just wanted to say for folks who've just joined a little bit early, so Phil and Nana and Jack and Tim and Michelle and Lisa and Adam, Mark, Gary, Eric, Brian, Waltz, you guys have been here for a while. Another Brian, Betty, Chris, Stephanie, Scott, Sandy, Rich, Richard, Lisa, Karen, Todd. Great to have all of you guys here. Phil's just joined. Looks like we've had John who's just joined. Welcome, John. And Chuck is with us. Randy's just jumped on. Hey, Randy, good to have you here. Looks like Denise is with us. Steve's just jumped on. So great to have all of you guys here. We're about a minute from getting started. I'll tell you the format for today. Jared is a bit of a different shtick. So this is a Built to Sell Radio Intel where Jeremy's going to do the interviewing, and he's going to sort of talk. We're going to just kind of riff about some of the last few stories of Built to Sell Radio. You can ask questions, and you can do that in the GoToWebinar control panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. So we'll take questions, as many as we can in the time we've got. Looks like Stuart's joined us, Lori, James, Christina, George, Kevin. Heron's with us, another Gordon, Steve. I can't name them all, but it's great to have all of you guys here. And with that, I'm going to introduce Jeremy Weisz, who is the co-founder of Rise25. Jeremy, you've done a lot of these interviews with entrepreneurs, so tell us where you want to go from here.
Yeah, I'm excited because Built to Sell Intel is one of my favorite things of the month. We get to hear your expertise, John. I know on the interviews, you're asking the questions, but I want to hear your biggest takeaways from these interviews. So we're going to recap the biggest takeaways from the last month on Built to Sell Radio. And you're going to, John here is going to overlay his thoughts and advice, which I'm excited to hear. And you do an amazing job of asking the questions, but now I want to hear your expertise. And if you don't know John, if you're on here, he's the founder of Value Builder System. It's a simple software for building the value of a company used by thousands of businesses worldwide. The Value Builder System, incorporates, people don't know. I mean, some people just know as the book. Some people know the diagnostic tools, John. It includes a Value Builder score. If you haven't taken it, go to their website and take it. And it's offered by a global network of their independent advisors known as certified value builders. And I've talked to a number of them, and it's really interesting the expertise they can overlay. And those businesses that achieve the value builder score of 90 or greater are worth double the average performing business. And so check out his book, Built to Sell. I think I've listened to it, John, maybe 3 times or so. I'm just a slow learner. It's creating a business that can thrive without you. And it's been recognized by Fortune Inc. as one of the best business books. And you could also obviously check out Built to Sell Radio. He wrote The Automatic Customer and his latest one, The Art of Selling Your Business. So check all of those out and go to builttosell.com. But I want to chat first with, the last month's episodes include Sean Finder, Kieran Dave Kirpin, Eytan Wiener, and Sebastian Johnston. And there's so many lessons in these. And I wanted to start with Sean Finder. And Sean Finder, if you should check it out, but basically he founded AutoClose, and it was an email marketing platform, and he built AutoClose to 1 million in revenue. When he was at a conference and just randomly he met, it led to an acquisition conversation with VanillaSoft, And it was interesting about the conversation, which I want to hear your thoughts on, was the company, the valuation the company Vanilla did was way off from what Sean thought it was worth. And so I'd love to hear, there were a couple things about maximizing customer retention, keeping your books in order, and the acquisition when they're so far apart. So I'd love to hear what you liked about Sean's story.
So much to like in Sean's story. One of the things that you raised in your introduction was that he met his ultimate acquirer at a trade show. And I think this is so common. I hear it again and again that you go to a trade show and not only are you meeting potential customers, but you're also meeting potential acquirers, because the same people that are exhibiting in the trade show are going to be in the same industry, have all kinds of strategic reasons to buy you. So it's just one of those hidden reasons to show up at your industry events, even if you're kind of bored and tired of them. I realize we've all been kind of locked out of industry events for the last 18 months, but hopefully here soon, we'll be able to get back to doing trade shows and conferences. And I think it's just one of these hidden reasons that to go is to meet potential acquirers. So yeah, I think that stood out for sure. And I also really, was shocked by or kind of was taken aback by just the gap between where Sean was on valuation. He was looking for 8 times revenue. And we should mention AutoClose is a software company, right? So they trade at sort of totally different multiples than traditional businesses, but he was looking for 8 times revenue, and VanillaSoft, when their first sort of foray, they came in at 2 times revenue. So there was like a massive gap between the two, which I think was a pretty big gap to close.
That's what I wanted you to talk about, because you get to ask the questions, but what are some best practices in navigating that? You don't want to piss someone off, obviously. What have you seen or heard or experienced navigating when it's you're so far from apart? But I'm sure it happens all the time. Like they come in at X amount and then you're expecting Y. What are some best practices in navigating that and in maintaining the relationship, even if maybe you're not interested?
Yeah. I mean, a couple of simple things out of the gate is to remain composed and not lose your cool. There's really no benefit. I mean, we hear these stories, business folklore, people like pounding their fist on the table. It's in my experience, that never works. I think being very cordial and calm through the process. They've probably had to go through some hoops to develop an offer, maybe getting permission for their board. So even the fact that you're getting an offer, even if it's lower than you want, they've probably done some work. So acknowledging that and thanking them for that, I think, is important. I think time can be on your side. Obviously, if you're not happy with the offer, there's no reason to enter into a furious negotiation. In Sean's case, he did a great job. He sort of said, like, I think we're just too far apart here. Happy to kind of keep the conversation going. But he didn't sort of force the issue. And so they kind of parted ways. I think 6 weeks later, VanillaSoft came back, said, look, we've met with our board, we're still interested, and I think we can get closer on the deal terms. And I think their next offer went from 2 times to 3.5 times revenue. So now, we're getting into a conversation, and I think Sean was sort of leaning in at that point. So that was good. I think the other thing that I would say is, and this is one of my big learnings from listening to this episode and listening to others as well, is that acquirers are going to try to get a proprietary deal. A proprietary deal being where they negotiate just directly with you. You don't try to get competing offers. I mean, that's the panacea for an acquirer, right? That you're too lazy, naive, inexperienced to go get other offers. And I think they're preying on you, right? Like they're trying to get your business for less than it's worth without competitive tension. And again, the deal here, they started at, I think, somewhere between 1.5 and 2 times revenue. And I think they ultimately ended up at 5 and change. I think that's what I've written down here, 4.5 to 5 times revenue. So, I mean, they came up like more than 2 times. And that was partly, Sean's experience and his kind of negotiating panache, but it also just shows that the initial offer they're going to give you, in many cases, is far below their expectations, and they're trying to kind of get you without competition. And it's one of the reasons I think almost all businesses are better served by creating a competitive marketplace for their company, regardless of how disruptive it may seem at the time.
Yeah, he walked away in a nice way, and it's sometimes maybe hard to not get emotional if someone just like feels like an insult, but it's not you're saying it's not personal. Like they had their way of coming to a number and maybe just appreciate the offer in general. Oftentimes we don't have the gratitude and appreciation, and just let that, think about that first before you get mad about in a lower offer than you want.
Yeah, and I think the second thing is he went back with justification for his second what he wanted, right? So he didn't just go, that's not good enough, I need you to do better, or that's not good enough, I need you to hit X. He went back with 8 times revenue, but he had some pretty significant justification for that. So we said, look, I mean, if you wanted to write as many lines of code as I've written to build this software, it would take you many millions of dollars at, he'd written it out. It says, like, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but it's like 270,000 lines of code. And if you hire a developer in these countries, you're paying 64 cents per line of code. Again, I'm not, the numbers are wrong. The principle is right. Yeah. The idea was that he basically, he put the math on the table to the acquirer and said, even if we're just buying the code, it would cost you this many millions of dollars to write that code. And I think that's a really interesting play. We talk about this idea of A, doing the math for the acquirer, but B, there's a conversation that happens in a boardroom when you're not there. As an entrepreneur, you're not there, and the conversation is the build versus buy decision. And that's when they close the door at VanillaSoft and they're like, okay, we got this guy Finder, he wants 8 times revenue for his company. Like, he's built this email solution. Like, if we were going to build it from scratch, it would cost us X millions of dollars in development and Y years in time. And the other alternative is to buy him, and he wants 8 times. What do you think? And it's the build versus buy decision. And again, if you make the case in your conversation that to build what you've created would take years and many millions of dollars, that's a way to make the case that it's just simply worth buying you. So I think Sean did a great job on making that case.
I love that. Yeah, John, I love that because you make it objective, and also it's proactive. Like, I feel like people can take a proactive approach to that because they're going to go back in to that room and think, should we build this or should we buy it? So I love what you said there, because if they're going to have that conversation, just be proactive about it and give the numbers to back it up. Yeah. So I want to take anyone who has questions, ask them in the chat. I'm going to take them in a minute. But before we take the question, John, I'm curious what you thought about his decision. They kind of iterated as a company. So they were selling email lists, and then they saw the people were taking the email lists and using these other platforms to send these cold emails out. It's a big decision to just start a software company, I think. Yeah. They could have just kept down that route. And this kind of goes into your thoughts on subscription. If anyone listens to Built to Sell, and there's key drivers, there's subscription models in Automatic Customer. What did you think about? I wonder if they would have his decision to create a software company, which is a big undertaking, despite selling these one-off like email lists.
Yeah. I mean, kudos to Sean for doing that, because I think selling email lists, hawking kind of third-party emails, it's a tough way to make a living, and I think it's a very highly commoditized space, and you're flirting up against the rules. Sean didn't break any rules. He was careful about GDPR and Castle and all that stuff. So I'm not suggesting he was breaking the rules, but the rules are always changing in that space, and you're sort of at the mercy of the government regulations. That one change in rules can put you out of business basically overnight. So it's not a very good business to be in, frankly. Not a very sellable company either. So I think the decision was cool. It was courageous. It was like, one day we're selling bananas, the next day we're selling watermelons. Like, it's a it's a departure, like in a big way, obviously. But he did have some pre-existing customers. He had some great enterprise customers that were buying his lists that were natural, purchases of the software. And I think he kind of transitioned pretty well. I mean, there aren't a lot of list brokers that could turn around and become software, developers. And so I think, kudos to him for doing it. I think it's a bold move, but I think it was a smart one.
So question from the audience, and at each of these, just feel free to put them in the chat the whole way through and we'll look at them. But a question, you asked a question, John, about churn. And so question from the audience is, what have you seen companies do to help lower churn? Because that probably comes up over and over in subscription-based or SaaS companies.
Sure. Yeah. Well, Sean nailed this. You're right, because in the beginning he didn't have a clue what he was doing. I think he admitted that on the episode. But they had a very self-serve,
like 40% churn, or I forgot what it was on the episode. Yeah.
It was massive. It was 30 or 40%. It was through the roof. And basically, in the early days, they had a very hands-off onboarding process, right? So people would buy auto close, and they might get a couple of emails saying, "Hey, welcome to the family. Let us know you have questions," kind of thing. And the support was handled through some ticketing process, and it was a nightmare. And you're right, they had just astronomical churn. It was just a massive leaky bucket. And so, clearly something had to change. And what they did was hired an onboarding specialist, a customer success person, to bring new clients into the fold. And that really dramatically improved their churn rates, or their retention rates dramatically dropped their churn rates. And I can't remember, Jeremy, do you remember the actual data points off the top of your head?
Oh, you mean what it improved to?
Yeah.
I don't remember, but it was significant. It was like, I think it was maybe like 10%. It went from like, 40 to like 10 or 5 or something.
Yeah,
but
it was
way less.
In the beginning, it was like arguable if they actually had a subscription company, if they were turning over like their entire customer base each year, sort of thing. And then by the time they sold the business, it had gotten much more kind of in line with what are typical churn rates in a SaaS business. So that was great. And I think the difference for them, and I think the transferable lesson to anybody is invest in onboarding. I think that's the one area where you can really reduce your churn rates, is to get your customers from the very beginning using your product correctly. It doesn't have to be just software products. It can be, I did a speech once for the Car Wash Owners Association. Like, that's a pretty,
I got to go watch that.
Yeah. But they're all moving to subscription models, as you know. And so you can buy now like a $30 or $40 a month, and you can go to the car wash as many times as you want. So it's a subscription model, right? And in the early days, the car wash owners were really hesitant because they thought of the world in terms of gross margin, right? So they're like, I charge $8 for a wash, and it's like $2 for the hot water and the soap. So why am I sending these guys through 10, 20, 30 times a month if it's going to cost me $2 for every time they go in? And they were thinking very much in this sort of cost structure. And the point I tried to make is first of all, people have got better things to do with their time than go to the car wash once a day. Second of all, what you're really trying to do is get them to see the value in the first month. So if they do come in 10 times in the first month, that's great. That means they're going to be a very loyal subscriber. So kind of over-invest in the first 30 days to a point where you're underwater in that relationship, because that's going to make it sticky for years to come.
No pun intended. But yes, I love that. So thanks for sharing that. I want to get to the next one. And
Sure.
If anyone thinks of other questions, you'll put them in, we'll address them. But so Carrie and Dave Kirpin, they started Likable Media, social media agency in 2006. The business grew to more than 50 employees, and the couple met for their annual partners retreat. They were thinking, what should we do here? Their business had gone up, but they realized when they had that meeting that 90% of their net worth was tied up in the business, and so they decided to sell. And they quickly received a cash offer, 100% cash offer of 6.5 times. Which seemed too good to be true, and I'll let you kind of do the punchline on that, John. But and what happened with that? And they had a number of LOIs out, I think, on the business. Some, for 60% upfront, 100% upfront. So it just varied with different, levels of multiples there. So I'd love for you to talk about what you liked about their story. And obviously, you talked about productizing a service. You talked about the power of naming during that episode. They leveraged interns to the nth degree. And they had this whole model of like tokens or having different billing system that made it subscription. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and what you liked about their story.
Well, let me finish the punchline for you on the 100% cash offer for a marketing services business, which is virtually unheard of. So 6.5 times earnings, which is like it's a good outcome for a 50 employee company, service-based business. I think in my experience, that would be a fairly good outcome. But I've never heard of a marketing services company, or I shouldn't say never, very rarely would a marketing services company trade without some sort of earnout where, part of the proceeds would be at risk in the future. And so sure enough, weeks into the deal, Carrie gets a call from the acquirer and says, I know we were going to do 100% cash up front, but we've changed our mind. And then they wanted to structure it so that they would pay most of it out over years into the future. And so Carrie and Dave rightly walked away. And in part because they, I think, came to the conclusion that it was a bait and switch. It wasn't like they'd found something in due diligence that led to them to be cautious. It was that they hooked them in with a 100% cash offer, emotionally get them attached to the sale, and ultimately change the rules towards at the end, gambling that that time they would be emotionally connected or invested in the sale. So it's a classic trick used by acquirers, and I to Dave and Carrie's great credit, they chose not to take the bait, and in fact said no, and they walked away, and ultimately a few months later got an offer of 8.5 times earnings, so a full 2 turns better, with a little bit of an earnout, but a much better terms than were being offered. So it had a happy ending, but not. It was to Dave and Carrie's credit that they were willing to walk away. So that's one. I, like you, Jeremy, I took away a lot from the kind of little family retreat they had, because I think it was 90% of their net worth, or something. I think they were estimating that 90% of their net worth was tied to their business. And I think Dave, if memory serves, Jeremy, you can remind me, but Dave is a little bit more, like comfortable with risk, but Carrie is like hyper conservative.
Yes.
And she just couldn't bear the thought that 90% of her, their net worth is tied up in this company. And so they decided to sell. And it's a great example of what we refer to as the freedom point. And we're actually coming out with a new tool at Value Builder called the Freedom Score, which is designed to really help owners think about this. But when your business reaches the value that by selling it, after tax and transactional costs, you've got enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life, it's really worth asking, like why not sell? Because for every day you hold it, you are effectively risking something that you probably have worked years to attain, which is financial independence, right? I mean, I think it was Warren Buffett who said, like, it's insane to risk what you want for something you don't. And when you reach financial freedom or you would reach it by selling your company, it's a really important time to pull up and say, hey, like, this is a shot, right? And we never know, especially in a services business, marketing services of all things, you never know. New technology could wipe you out. Employees could leave en masse. Clients could leave. I mean, there's a litany of things that can happen.
Mass pandemic can occur.
Yeah, it goes on. So I think it's just worth asking that question. And you're right. If anybody wants to have a master class in how to productize a service, you need to listen to Dave and Carrie's episode. Oh my gosh. What an unbelievable masterclass. So they went from selling time, right, hours, like most services businesses, which of course is a hamster wheel to nowhere. It's like you're on a treadmill. It's a terrible business model. They went to your point, this content, what do they call it? The content credit system. And so instead of charging by the hour, they said, look, we're going to do your social content. We're going to do your tweets, your Facebook posts, your videos, your blog posts. We're going to do it all. And you're going to buy from us an annual allotment of credits. And a tweet might be 1 credit, a blog post might be 10, a video might be 20. And it's up to you, Mr. Customer, Mrs. Customer, how you want to spend your credits, but we're going to kind of negotiate a bulk, buy of credits. What does that do? Number one, it stops the commoditization effect of selling by the hour. As soon as you're selling by the hour, you're effectively commoditizing yourself and you're lumping yourself in with anybody else who does that. So you're a social media consultant, great. I know 3 of them on Upwork, and one of them's charging me $18 an hour. So what are you going to do to compete with that? Number 2, so it's a commoditization race to the bottom if you're charging by the hour. The second thing the content credit system did for them is it created recurring revenue, which is this, we've ad nauseum talked about this, but this is a very valuable revenue stream that acquires love because people bought the content credits on annual subscriptions, right? The third thing that it did, which I loved as well, was it made it easier for their account managers to sell. They had these account managers who were a bit squeamish about selling, didn't know exactly kind of how to have the conversation. They were good at kind of making sure the trains ran on time, but not necessarily great salespeople. But now all of a sudden, it's really easy to sell. Oh, you just ran out of credits. How many more credits would you like to buy? You don't have to be a rocket scientist or a great salesperson to sell a tangible thing like that. And I just love this story. There's so much to take away, especially for service company owners.
How can someone do that in a non-confusing way, do you think? Like, would you have any suggestions? I feel like they experimented with some of their customers and they kind of laid it out, because I could see myself confusing people very quickly if I come up with a credit system. And then are there ways that you have thought about that you could think about this, or other people should think about it, where you could release something that's subscription based if it's a credit system? Because I think this could apply to a lot of companies, like coming up with some kind of credit system. Any advice on not confusing someone? That would be my concern, is like, well, this is this credit, and now they're trying to figure out in their head the cost to the credit. That's what popped into my head when they were talking about it. I'm like, I can see myself totally confusing someone with it. Any suggestions on like rolling it out?
Yeah, I didn't have the foresight to ask that question. I should have asked it. You should have done the interview, Jeremy. I didn't think of that. But
no, I think
you're right.
They did talk about it a little bit.
Oh, did I? Okay.
You talked about they did talk about it a little bit, and they said that they asked some of the customers. I mean, there was so much going on there for the sale of the company. Like, that wasn't the point. I mean, but that's why we do the intel, right? Built to sell intel, because I'd love to hear your thoughts after the fact on how do you roll something like that out, not confuse people, or maybe do it in a good fashion, because it's a great idea. I'm just curious on your thoughts.
I think you want to prioritize simplicity over engineering it, right? So I sometimes see subscription models and there's like 6 choices. It's too many, right? You're going to paralyze your customer, right? They're just going to go, I don't know what to do. I mean, we've all been pitched the kind of silver, gold, platinum plan, right? And everybody goes for the middle one, which is a totally legitimate way to sell a subscription plan. But going beyond 3, I start to worry a little bit. I think play the end game. The end game is recurring revenue, retention. Like, if you think about like a retention, like a recurring revenue. I mean, if we go back to AutoClose, like he was getting 4.5 times revenue for his recurring revenue stream, right? So, if you're kind of nitpicking, you used a little bit more of this or a little bit less of that, and therefore we've got to really, change it. Yeah, I think you're over-engineering it. What you're striving for is annual recurring revenue, ARR, And the more stable that is and the longer it stays, the better. And so I wouldn't be penny rich and pound foolish, if to use that old English expression. I think they're, keep your eye on the prize, which is the recurring revenue. So simplicity, I wouldn't have a model where it's like, I'm not a big usage guy. So like some subscription models, like cell phones are the classic example of this, right? So you get a cell phone plan of like $40 a month, but then as soon as you exceed X number of minutes, the meter starts running, and those penalize the customer for using your product. And while they're a great way to increase, the revenue stream, the recurring revenue stream, they also make people hesitate using it. So I'm not a fan of the
You want
kind
to
of
encourage
meter
them to use
billing.
it.
What's that?
You want to encourage them to use it, what you're saying.
Yeah, you want
is
to
just-
encourage them to
yeah.
use it, right? So I think Dave and Kara did a great job of that. They weren't selling, 100 credits with the view that we know 6 months into the year we're going to be able to sell them another 100. Like that's not the way they were thinking about it. They were like, no, based on what you're trying to do and how much you used last year, like I think we're going to need about this number of credits. And so there wasn't this sort of bait and switch kind of attitude. And so I think they did a nice job of that. I don't have any secret sauce, but simplicity, I think, is Jeremy would be my.
Because I love that part of the conversation. So thanks for, don't overcomplicate it and encourage usage,
Yeah.
The other thing, so audience questions. So a big one on, there's actually two. Bait and switch conversation. Audience question, do you think it was really a bait and switch? What do you look for in a real bait and switch? Or maybe they were just inexperienced. It seemed like when they talked about it, the people really hadn't made many acquisitions. How do you tell if it's a true bait and switch, or if it's maybe, in this case, maybe the person was just or the company was inexperienced making acquisitions, so that they just realized that was not the right move?
Yeah, I think your question had the answer baked into it, which is, how experienced are they making acquisitions? I have a friend who made an acquisition. I'll leave his name out of it because he wouldn't want me to share it. But it was his first acquisition. It was a relatively small deal. He offered 100% up front, and a number of us were like, "Are you crazy? That's nuts!" And so he went back to them and said, "Oh, I've been thinking about it. Maybe we got to do this on a structured way." And so in his case, it was not some malicious intent or some kind of Machiavellian plan to get the business, bait and switch. It was just simple naivete on his behalf. I think if you're dealing with a sophisticated acquirer who has bought other businesses, it's unlikely it is just their naivete. It's likely a strategy. So again, I don't remember in Dave and Carey's case whether the acquirer, the kind of first one that offered 6.5 was a sophisticated acquirer. But I would be asking that question of myself and of them, like, how many other businesses have you bought? And if the number is more than one, I'd be surprised if it was unintentional.
The other question is about negotiating full control of the P&L when you are responsible for, obviously you only get the earnout if you hit your numbers, and they talked about negotiating full control of the P&L. What are the best ways to navigate that? And then the person just put full control of P&L. So I'm just kind of extrapolating a little bit about what they mean by that. But how can a founder start to negotiate that? Because then they have actually control over the outcome if they do.
Yeah. So it's a great question. I think. So let's define what an earnout is. An earnout is a situation where you have a set of goals that you need to hit in order to get a second tranche or third tranche of value for your company. And you're doing that usually in the context, certainly in a marketing services business, where you're sort of a division of a larger entity. And most of the time, the bookkeeping and management, the number crunching of your company kind of falls to the acquirer. So that basically take your bookkeeper, let them go and handle the financing at head office. That's usually the case. Now, I think in Dave and Carey's case, they were able to keep their finance person on staff, which enabled them to kind of control that. That's one sort of thing you can negotiate. I mean, it's an important strategic benefit to the acquirer to be able to eliminate your bookkeeper, right? So there's a salary there they can eliminate. So you might get some pushback on that. At the same time, that's one way to sort of make sure you're still in control of your billing. The other thing is like you can paper the deal as best you can, meaning you get a good lawyer and don't use the same lawyer that incorporated your business to run an M&A deal. It's usually it's a corporate finance attorney is what you want, or an M&A attorney who does this kind of work and does earnouts all day long and can do them in their sleep. I think the other piece of advice on that is to try to get your earnout tied to something other than earnings, because earnings is the most easily manipulated by head office, right? So they can graft additional costs onto your P&L, they can hold back budget items, they can put costs into your P&L that they control effectively, right? So that's the hardest thing to control. It's a little less easy for the acquirer to monkey with revenue, so it might be better to try to tie your earnout to revenue if possible. They might give you some pushback on that, but that's a little less subjective and a little more objective. I know Rob Walling, a guy I interviewed on Built to Sell Radio maybe 6 months ago, great business, built it up and sold it, and he was a product guy, like a product development guy at a software company, and so he chose to tie his earnout to the release of a product feature, which, being a product guy, he really knew that he could release, and so he had 100% confidence that he could release it. So those are a couple of ideas. Try to get your earnout tied to something other than earnings, because that's the most easily manipulated by head office.
I love that. So the next one, John, was Eytan Wiener, and so he was Eytan and Jonathan Goldman were co-founders of Quantum Networks. It started as like a simple Amazon reseller. I love how you got into the interview and really kind of peppered him with questions on the evolution of his business model, because it really started as like more of a Amazon reseller arbitrage, and then in technology gadgets, and then they were producing their own technology gadgets, and then they were bundling their technology gadgets with other bigger name products to create these custom bundles and exclusive things that they were doing for these other companies. So it was kind of cool to see the evolution of their brand, and also helping, they were bundling their services essentially so that they had this competitive edge, because like you said, it's kind of a commodity. And so they started their brand Blue Coil and started bundling the products, bought together, striking exclusive deals with reseller arrangements, and those things increased their sales and their top line revenue to like $30 million. And then it caught the attention of a publicly traded company. And some of the things that you talked about on there was how to differentiate yourself in competitors, the reasons they decided to sell, how the inventory was valued was another kind of interesting conversation in this e-commerce world, and how to know when an acquirer is motivated to close. So I'd love to hear what you liked about Eytan's story.
Yeah, it goes back to what we talked about earlier, which is the quiet conversation that happens in a boardroom when you're not there, which is, have these guys built something that is truly differentiated, unique, that would take us a long time to replicate? If so, it makes sense to buy them. If, however, they're really just selling on price, there's nothing to buy. You might as well just compete. And so in the early days, and like you, I really love the evolution of the business from unsellable, worthless company that's just basically running on a hamster wheel to a very sellable company. The unsellable, worthless company, and again, this goes back to anybody who's sort of in distribution, any Amazon resellers. I mean, if all you're doing is buying something, I mean, in his case, he was buying something from China. He was marking it up marginally, like I think his gross margin was 5%, and then he was selling it on Amazon. And so there's just no value in that whatsoever to an acquirer, as far as I can tell, in the sense that an acquirer will almost always have more money than you. They will almost always have more resources, and so they can simply buy the same trinket from China, and they can sell it for a penny less, and they can outgun you in a price war all day long. And so there's no value in buying your company. If they happen to want to be in the business of selling trinkets on Amazon, they can simply outbid you. And so that's a worthless business. And I think it was what for me was the most interesting part of the story was the transition. And so there were three things that he did which were brilliant. The first was build a brand. So all of a sudden it was a differentiated offering. It wasn't just a generic widget sourced in some faraway factory. It was a brand called Blue Coil, and people actually started to place value in the Blue Coil brand, and they started to look for it, and the ratings and so forth became meaningful. So they built a brand that was great. The other thing that they did is create exclusive contracts. So they said, look, we'll sell your widget or he was doing a lot of technology parts. So like microphones, like a lot of like the kind of plumbing of the technology space, wires and cables and stuff like that. And so he said, look, we're pretty handy and pretty savvy at selling on Amazon. We'll be able to sell your stuff on Amazon, but you got to give us exclusivity. And again, that gave him a moat around the product line. So nobody could just come in and basically start selling the same stuff. If you wanted to get a certain, wire brand, or you wanted to get a certain mic stand that you were seeking out, you had to buy it through Eytan. So he built those exclusive arrangements, and those two moves allowed him to get his gross margin from 5% up to 20%. Still a low margin business for those of us in software. Go back to Dave and Carey in services, they'd be 100% gross margin. But in the case of selling stuff, hard manufactured goods, 20% is better than 5%. Let's just put it that way. And then the third thing he did was bundles, and you touched on this in your introduction. So part of the way to differentiate a commoditized product is to bundle it with other things that make a solution, right? So I'll give you an example as a podcaster. And again, I know you've got this, about this world as well, Jeremy. Like if you're going to buy a mic, the chances are not only do you need a mic, but you might also need a mic stand, and you might need a pop filter, and you might need, a bunch of other things that podcasters need. And so instead of just selling each discrete product individually, he bundled them, and those bundles also gave him better gross margins. So I think it was the three things that he did that really sort of made the business from essentially unsellable to one that had some value.
Yeah, and I want to tell, in your Built to Sell, you talk about the 8 key drivers, and so I encourage anyone to check that out. And in them are the monopoly control and the Switzerland structure. And, you just talked about you mentioned this on the episode, is kind of like, how do you differentiate from your competitors with the monopoly control? I want you to touch on the Switzerland structure, because that conversation came up, and I liked what you talked about because of Amazon. And this also came up because of the other past episode with Beast Gear. There was that conversation with Eytan about how do you. So I'd love for you to talk about the Switzerland structure and then how that applies to this interview as far as Amazon goes.
Yeah. So Switzerland structure is one of the 8 drivers. It basically inspired by the country of Switzerland, where they're focused on independence, obsessed with it, some might say. In a business context, what you want to make sure is you don't have any customer concentration. So you don't have any, like, a major customer making up more than 20-25% of your revenue. That would be a big red flag. Secondly, an employee dependency. So if you've got one key salesperson, for example, that's going to be a problem, or one key operations person that sort of holds everything together with duct tape, that's going to be a problem. And then the third one, and the often overlooked one, but interestingly one I'm hearing much, much more about of late, is supplier concentration, meaning you're dependent on a single supplier or platform. And so we've done a few episodes. Beast Gear was one, Eytan was another, where they become dependent on a platform, and Amazon is the most likely culprit, in the sense that a rising tide lifts all boats. If you're an Amazon seller, Amazon has gone through the roof, right, in terms of its success, and then fueled by the pandemic, more people are buying stuff on Amazon, and so it brought everybody with it, anybody reselling their stuff on Amazon. The challenge, of course, is that if a large proportion of your revenue comes from Amazon, and Amazon delists you, which they're want to do if you're selling for less off Amazon, or you're actively trying to create relationships with their customers off Amazon, they can delist you or demote you in the search algorithm. If you don't buy enough paid search on their search algorithm, they can demote you. So it just creates this dependency, and it's like this junkie, right? Like you become addicted to the revenue, and it lets you puff your chest out and go to an EO meeting and say, yeah, we hit 10 million, or in Eytan's case, we hit 30 million. It's amazing. The challenge, of course, is that the further you go down that road, the less valuable your company is, because an acquirer will look at it and say, yeah, but if Amazon changes its algorithm or delists you, you're out of business. We see it with anybody who's deeply dependent on the Apple iTunes store, anyone who's dependent on Google's search term, like if they're driving a lot of their new revenue through SEO, search engine optimization, and they happen to rank in the top couple of listings for their product or service, that can be a major liability. If, again, Google is always tweaking its algorithm. If you get demoted, it can put you out of business if like 90% of your revenue is coming from organic search. So any one of these platforms are great individually, but if they start to become a huge part of your revenue, it can be a cause for concern for acquirers.
So audience question, John, about in this situation, the question is, what do you look for in a strategic buyer? Because I feel like also in this situation, I think the Advantage Solutions was a strategic buyer that can kind of put fuel on by acquiring. And I believe also with VanillaSoft, I think that was also, a strategic acquisition, because they did SMS text. And so all their customers were there. So this person's wondering, what do you look for in like an ideal strategic buyer? Because obviously you probably get the most value out of that relationship.
Yeah, so three types of acquirers, right? Individual investors, they're buying themselves a job most commonly, pay the lowest for your business usually. Private equity companies rolling up businesses in your industry, so they're trying to take advantage of synergies. Oftentimes they're getting an accretive lift off buying lots of businesses in the same industry, and then they get a higher multiple for the collection than you do for the individual parts. And then strategics, and I think the question was around strategic acquirers, whereas strategic has something that they have that gives them sort of an investment thesis. That's M&A lingo for there's some sort of strategic value. So, in the case of VanillaSoft and AutoClose, VanillaSoft had lots of customers asking for an email solution. They had the customers, they just didn't have the solution. In the case of Quantum Networks' acquisition of Eytan's business, I think, again, they had customers, they're in the business of, they got their start in the kind of sampling space. If you ever go to Kroger's and people are like sampling new sausages, they're the staffing folks that did that. Well, a lot of their customers are looking to get more into e-commerce and looking for e-commerce chops. So there was a reason for them to buy Eytan's business, because they understood sort of how to sell on Amazon. So you're looking for someone that has strategic assets that they could frankly leverage better than you can, right? They've either got a big sales force or a massive distribution channel, or they've got some product hold, but your business is worth more in their hands than it is in your hands. It's kind of the definition of a strategic acquirer.
Yeah, love it. And we're going to get to Sebastian Johnston. This was a kind of a question comment in the chat. I'll just mention it, but because we were chatting about the credits, and this person wrote that they used to work at an energy company and they tried to sell BTUs rather than fuel, oil, natural gas, or coal. And this is what the person said. The customer furnaces were set to be able to receive all three ways to use the feedstock. So they tried to sell these BTUs. It seems like this person said in the media content credits very similar. And he said, I don't know, from what he said, if it worked or not, because he said buying the BTUs was too confusing for the average buyer. So I don't know if they're saying the average buyer is not, their buyer wasn't average and it was confusing or not, but just, I guess, another example where this credit system has been applied with this energy company. They tried to have this BTUs. So I thought that was interesting. They shared it in the chat.
Yeah, great. Yeah, great. And I think, there, with any subscription model where you're changing the prevailing wisdom, the prevailing billing model, like architects, professional services, you charge by the hour. That's the prevailing sort of model, and people kind of get it, and they understand that. And so I think that is a significant risk that you will confuse customers, which is why I do think that trying to keep it simple, very simple for the end consumer, makes a lot of sense. Ultimately, I think the upside, as Dave and Carey's case studies suggest, is much greater. It's sort of worth the risk, but
Yeah.
But anyway, I'll leave Dave and Carrie to share their experience on that. It's a great episode. And again, if you're into listening, if you want to understand productizing a service business, it's a masterclass for sure. And if people want to find these episodes, since you're listening to Built to Sell Radio, I'm assuming you know where to find them. But you can simply like type in the name of the guest and the words Built to Sell Radio into Google, and it'll pop right up. So if folks are looking for these stories, it's pretty easy to find.
Yeah, check it out. And so, or you can go to builttosell.com, I think /radio as well, right?
They're all listed there.
So Sebastian Johnston, so three friends, they co-founded the TheAmazeApp in 2014. The idea was, so social media influencers could upload a picture of what they were wearing, tag the clothing on the TheAmazeApp's database of e-commerce retailers, and they receive a commission. And TheAmazeApp would also receive a commission that they shared with the influencer. And they raised $800,000 through an accelerator, 500 startups, and they leveraged their influencers to drive traffic. Essentially, grew to 4 million active users per month, and 8 months later was acquired by Zalando, which was one of Europe's largest fashion wholesalers. And so, I guess some of the key points were how the traffic arbitrage business model works, how to get developers to accept shares instead of cash for their work, which is interesting, and how an acqui-hire works, and why would you reveal the name of the other bidders for your company, and how he kept a poker face through the negotiation despite they're starting to run out of cash. And while the acquirer dealt with, they were, actually a big component of how they were serving up the data too. So I'd love to hear what you liked about Sebastian's story.
Yeah, I mean, Sebastian himself is a really interesting guy, young guy and dynamic. And so I enjoyed talking to him. I have to be honest with you, Jeremy, it took me a while to get my head around the business model because I'm not a social media guy. I don't really understand what influence, I understand what an influencer is, but it's a world that is really foreign to me. So what I came to learn is that there are these influencers, like people with social media followings on Instagram and other platforms, who make their living effectively promoting certain products. Again, that's kind of like weirdly narcissistic and all kinds of problems that I can think of associated with that.
You said on there, so I like that you didn't know this because I didn't either, and it helped me to kind of understand. And you're like, so why would Brad Pitt, I think in one point you're like, why would Brad Pitt bother posting his picture?
Yeah.
So it sounded like it was this like middle tier of like influencers, not like an A-list celebrity. And so they'll go through the whole, effort of doing it. Right.
Yeah, it sounds like a horrible way to make a living. just I'll just say that outright. But I guess there are these sort of B-list celebrities, we'll call them in air quotes, who will put on an outfit and they'll like take a picture of themselves and post it to some platform. And the idea behind Sebastian's business is that if people saw that picture and say, oh, I really like that hat that guy's wearing, they could click on the hat and it would link through to their ability to buy the hat. And what was, again, it goes back to supplier dependency here. What was interesting was that for this model to work, they needed to have the back-end database of all the products effectively, all the fashion products that were effectively out there. So like millions and millions and millions of different products, shirts and hats and scarves and so forth. They needed a database of real time. They didn't have some manual person like uploading the SKU into, like, it needed to be fed for it to work, given the fact that there are millions of unique fashion items, colors, sizes. It had to be a database. And so
kind of technology at play where it will recognize it or something like that.
That's right. So I'm wearing a hat and they, it just basically sucked the information out of the database about that hat. And so the only way it would work is if you had all the data. Well, I guess in Europe, there are about 5 major e-commerce retailers that control like 90% of the e-commerce, the fashion bought on e-commerce. So Sebastian knew he had to get all 5 of those. The problem was this one company, Zalando, which I didn't know until I had the interview, like kind of dominates something like 70% of the market, right? So 70% of the data that this whole model is contingent on is controlled by this one company, Zalando. And so when he got into the negotiation, Zalando knew that. They knew they had him over a barrel. They knew that his business would be virtually worthless without them. And although he tried to get the other e-commerce data providers to come to the table, and initially he got sort of 3 interest, like not LOIs, but sort of indications of interest, so to speak. Pretty quickly, the 2 others dropped off, and he was left negotiating just with Zalando. And I think, in his own admission, like that was a really weak negotiating position, right? Because he was so dependent on data. And it just goes back to the earlier point about sort of supplier risk and platform risk. If you're susceptible to that, it can discount your valuation.
I'd love to talk about, it seems like a difficult business model because you have to get this influence on the platform and traffic, and then you have to get the data. There's just a couple pieces.
Chicken or egg thing.
Yeah.
I mean, Airbnb, when it works, it's a beautiful thing, right? But getting both sides to coalesce on the same marketplace at the same time is really tough. And I think in his case, he was successful to getting 4 million unique users a month or whatever it was, because he relied on his B-list celebrities to drive traffic. He wasn't advertising. So he had that, and I think that was one of the really nice pieces of his business model, is the one side of the marketplace, he had a kind of killer way to get that to the table. The challenge was the other side of the marketplace was supplying the data, and that was consolidated in 5 companies' hands. And actually, really, most of it was in one company's hands. And that's where the vulnerability of the business model was.
So one part of the story I thought was very interesting was that applies to any business or a lot of businesses, how to get developers to accept shares instead of cash. And maybe for a company, maybe it's not developers, maybe it's a CMO, maybe it's whatever position. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on maybe what he did, but maybe how you've seen people navigate this, maybe because they're bootstrapping, or maybe in this case, maybe they raise 800K, but really the product they're creating would take $5 million to produce, but because they got developers to accept shares, they can produce a much superior product to what their budget allows. So what are some ways you found people navigate this successfully, as far as getting people buying shares or whatever, I guess, they've decided to be creative about?
Yeah, I think this is just one of the many instances where, I think, I can't remember who said it, or someone is sort of, it's a famous saying, but it takes money to make money, or, the rich keep getting richer, or, this sentiment that, like, once you become successful, it's way more likely and way more easier to get even more successful than it is to get your first rung kind of on the ladder. And this is another example of that. Sebastian had other startups that he had been successful with. And so every entrepreneur under the sun who's bootstrapping their company is going to ask their developers to take shares, or their graphic designer to take shares. I mean, it's like the kind of most common trick, and not trick, but kind of most common strategy to bootstrap. Hey, I'll give you some shares, right? And so most people have sort of heard that before and thought, I'll take the cash, thanks. But in his case, because he had the track record of successful startups in his past, it just carried a lot more legitimacy, right? Like, I've built and sold these 4 companies, and we're going to do the same with this 5th company, and we're going to offer you some shares in return for developing the solution. That's a very different conversation than some like 20-year-old coming out of high school that says, take shares of my company. It's a totally different conversation. And so I don't have any really practical advice for brand new businesses that don't have a pedigree or a track record. But if you do have a track record, merchandise that by all means. I mean, it gives you credibility. And it's one of the many. It's easier to raise money once you've had a successful business. It's easier to do all sorts of things once you've sort of had a win. Yeah. So one of the reasons, by the way, Jeremy, that I think, like, we talk and fight about this, this sort of sense that a lot that business owners, I think, become inert in their company. You know, they build a successful business, and it may not be growing very much. You know, they may not be enjoying it very much, but they just think, yeah, it's so great. Why would I sell it? Well, I mean, when I talk to people like that, I talk to them about the freedom point, number one. Number two, I think what I'd ask them is like, are you truly happy doing this, or are you inert? Has inertia taken over? And number three, this is your training wheels business. Like, trust me when I tell you, if you hit a single in a baseball analogy and sell this company, your next company will be infinitely more successful, infinitely more valuable, because you'll take everything you learned in this first company and you'll inject that into your next company. It's like your training wheels business. And I think just, you know, there's so many examples of, you know, the second, the third, the fourth business being much, much more successful than the first. So I guess in Sebastian's case, he'd had some stuff on, you know, he had some successful companies already started that gave him some credibility.
You know, so the last question, this will be audience question, John, and we'll have to kind of glean from it a little bit of what they mean, but it's kind of, the question is about staying versus leaving right away from a founder perspective. And I'm not sure exactly what the person meant, but it's an interesting question, because in the case of, you know, Eytan, you know, him and his co-founder, one of them stayed, Eytan left. And Carrie was all in. It's like, I'll stay as long as you want. I don't want to leave. And in this one, Sebastian, the partners were like split. I think like you got in this conversation, wait, like, so you just left right away, but two other people were still there. And it was an interesting question, or a dialogue. So I'd love to hear of kind of the, just speak to the staying versus leaving and the considerations people should and shouldn't make.
Oh man, that's a great question, and I'm not sure I have a pithy answer to it. It's first of all, it's much more complicated when you've got partners, because oftentimes the partner staying can feel like they're left holding the bag a little bit, and the other partner is sort of riding off into the sunset with a big whack of cash in their jeans, and they kind of wonder like, how did I end up working for like a middle manager in Des Moines, Iowa, and having to fly to, you know, that kind of stuff. It's not a great situation. So look, I think it can be a challenge in a case of partners. I also think you have to be realistic in the industry that you're in. Industries like marketing services, like professional services, it's very rare for those businesses to trade hands without some sort of earnout for both founders or multiple founders to stay over time. Now, are there examples where it doesn't happen? Absolutely. We'll talk next month about a woman named 𝘎𝙊𝙇𝙇 who got out of a marketing service business without an earnout. So that's an example, but it's pretty rare. So I think being mindful of the industry you're in, what the sort of norm is, would be helpful. That being said, you can try to negotiate for the majority of your cash up front, so the earnout is more like gravy than the foundation of your proceeds. So I think that's a good best practice. And there's some industries where earnouts are not necessarily that significant. You know, software as an example, manufacturing. Sometimes they're just not as likely to be tied to an earnout. So I think being realistic about the industry you're in is also another strategy. But it's one of those questions. I guess the third thing I'll share is just getting really clear in your own mind before the negotiation. If you have a red line, if there's a hard line in the sand that you're not willing to cross, either a proportion of your proceeds that are at risk, or you know, a tenure of your transition period. Like if 5 years is totally off the table, is 3 years okay? If 3 years is not okay, is 1 year okay? Like getting really clear in your own mind what those are before you go into negotiation, and kind of write them down. Have a coach holds you accountable to those, because once you're in it, you know, the deal can take a life of its own, and I think you may find you compromise on something that you don't want to compromise on. So I think being clear on those things up front is probably also a good strategy.
I love that. The one that I can't remember the person's name that you interviewed with the pet app had like really a line in the sand of like, I am not travel, something about I am not traveling. And they brought up travel once he was on. He's like he was nice about it.
Section 3, paragraph 2 of our deal.
I said, I'm not, and they totally got it. So I love that part. And it was interesting. I was talking to someone I know recently, and they'd sold their company. There were 2 co-founders, and one of them was leaving, one of them was staying. And the one that was staying said, I thought it was interesting, they said, I'm going to look to see all the mistakes you make with leaving, so I won't make the mistakes you made with this company when I leave. So I thought that was an interesting perspective of, like you say, like holding the bag. And this person perceived it as, I'm going to be like the older sibling. I'm going to watch what, the parents do to you. And then I'll just not do the same things.
I'll just ride under the,
exactly. So anyways, on that note, I think everyone should check out 𝑏uilttosell.com. Subscribe to if you haven't, so you can go to ask questions and future webinars. Also go to 𝑏uilttosell.com/radio and check out all the past episodes. So John, I don't know if there's any other place we should point people towards online.
No, I think that's great. Yeah, 𝑏uilttosell.com/radio, and you can get all these Sebastian's episode and the other 3. They're all there, and along with speaker notes, transcripts. So I hope you enjoy them.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for doing this, Jeremy. It's good to be with you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. Hey, if you like today's episode, you're going to love my new book, The Art of Selling Your Business. The book was inspired by the cohort of my guests over the years who have been able to negotiate an exit far better than the benchmark in their industry, sometimes 2 or 3 times more than I would have expected. I was curious to understand the tactics and strategies of these entrepreneurs and what they do differently from average performers. The result is a playbook for punching above your weight when it comes to selling your business. To learn more, go to builttosell.com/selling, where we put together a collection of gifts for listeners who order the book. Just go to builttosell.com/selling. Built to Sell Radio is produced by Haley Parkhill. Our audio and video engineer is Dennis Labataglia. If you like what you've just heard, subscribe to get a new episode delivered to your inbox each week. Just go to builttosell.com.
Thanks for listening to Built to Sell Radio with John Warrillow. For complete show notes with links to additional resources, visit builttosell.com/blog. John is the founder of the Value Builder System. To find out how to improve the value of your business by 71%, visit valuebuildersystem.com. John is also the author of Built to Sell, Creating a Business That Can Thrive Without You, and The Automatic Customer, Creating a Subscription Business in Any Industry. Connect with John at facebook.com/builttosell or on Twitter at John Warrillow, WARRILLOW. Thanks for listening.